The word appeared on a morning so cold that the breath of the horses turned to white ribbons in the courtyard air. It was a single word, traced with a fingertip into the fine layer of frost that had settled overnight on the glass of the Duke's carriage window. Not scratched, not carved, written with the deliberate care of someone who had chosen every stroke, someone who had stood close enough to leave behind the faintest warmth of a human hand against the frozen pain. The head groom, Tallis, found it first. He had come out at dawn to prepare the carriage for the Duke's morning ride to the village, and he stood there in the gray half-light, his polishing cloth hanging limp at his side, staring at the glass as though the word might rearrange itself into something less troubling. He did not touch it. He did not wipe it away. He backed out of the carriage house and went to find the steward. Mr. Garrick arrived within minutes. He was a lean man with a narrow jaw and eyes the color of wet slate, a man whose authority over the household at Thornmere Hall was absolute in all things except those reserved for the Duke himself. He moved through the estate like a blade, precise and cold and never idle. The staff feared him with a quiet, practiced deference, and he accepted their fear as the natural condition of good order. He stepped into the carriage house, pulling his coat tighter against the morning chill. Tallis pointed at the window without speaking. Garrick bent forward. He read the word, and something changed in his face. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was a brief, involuntary spasm of recognition, the kind a man makes when a door he believed locked and buried opens without warning. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled at his sides. For 3 full seconds, the steward of Thornmere Hall did not breathe. Then he straightened and his expression became stone again. "Wipe it off," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "Speak of this to no one." But it was too late. The second groom had already seen. The kitchen boy who carried the morning slop pails had paused at the courtyard gate and glimpsed the commotion. By the time the household sat down to breakfast in the servants' hall, the whisper had spread like smoke through a drafty house. Someone had written something on the Duke's carriage. A single word, a name no one recognized, Ashburn. The notice appeared on the servants' hall board before midday, penned in Garrick's own angular hand. It declared that any defacement of property belonging to His Grace the Duke of Thornmere would be treated as a dismissible offense. All staff were reminded that the carriage house, the stables, and the estate workshops were restricted areas outside of assigned duties. Any person found in these areas without explicit authorization from the steward would face immediate and permanent removal from service. It was written for everyone. It was aimed at one person. Aven Calder had been at Thornmere Hall for just over 3 months. She was the newest of the housemaids, a slight young woman with dark auburn hair kept pinned beneath a plain white cap and a stillness about her that the other servants found unsettling. She was not unfriendly. She was simply contained, as though she carried an invisible wall around her that no casual conversation could penetrate. She did her work with a quiet, meticulous competence that should have earned her respect, but instead earned her suspicion. People who ask no questions in the experience of the servants' hall usually have something to hide. And Aven had been seen in the courtyard that morning. She had been carrying ash buckets to the refuse heap, a task that took her past the carriage house door at precisely the wrong hour. It was a coincidence, or it appeared to be. But coincidence is a currency that buys nothing in a household governed by a man like Garrick. By noon, the sideways glances had started. By evening, the empty seat beside hers at the long table had widened by another few inches. Aven felt the shift the way one feels a change in the weather. She did not need to read the notice to know what it said. She saw it in the sudden silence when she entered the kitchen, in the way the laundry maid moved her pile of mending to the far end of the bench, in the sharp assessing gaze that Garrick fixed upon her as she passed him in the corridor, a gaze that lasted 1 beat too long. She had known the risk. She had known it the moment her finger had touched the frozen glass, the moment the word had formed beneath her hand, as though it had been waiting there, patient and inevitable, needing only her courage to make it visible. She had done it. In the small, dark hours before dawn, when the courtyard was empty, and the world was nothing but frost and silence, it was not an act of vandalism. It was a message, a name thrown like a stone into still water, meant for one pair of eyes only. She had not expected Garrick to find it first. Now she understood that the stone had landed, and the ripples were spreading in directions she could not control. She carried her ash buckets with her usual measured pace. She swept the upper corridors without a word, and she did not look at the notice on the board. But behind her calm, her mind was racing. Garrick had recognized the name. She had seen it in the way his orders that morning had carried a new sharpness, a controlled urgency that betrayed itself in the white of his knuckles and the thinness of his voice. He knew what Ashburn meant. He knew, and he was afraid. That fear confirmed everything. In the great house above, behind the closed doors of the library, the Duke of Thornmere knew nothing of the word on his carriage window. He would not learn of it for 2 more days, and when he did, it would arrive not as an answer, but as the beginning of a question that would consume him entirely. But that morning, as Avon knelt on the cold flagstones of the upper hall and wrung her cloth into a pail of gray water, she permitted herself one small, fierce thought. She was still here. She had not been caught. And the man who held the keys to this house, the man whose brother had destroyed her life, now knew that someone remembered. Someone remembered everything. The horse was called Solstice. He was a creature that seemed to have been assembled from darkness itself, 17 hands of pure black muscle and bone with a mane that fell like a curtain of ink and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He had belonged to Lord Emmerich Deverell, the Duke's younger brother, and in the months before Emmerich's death, the two of them had been inseparable. They had ridden together across the high fells in all weathers, Emmerich laughing into the wind, the great horse beneath him moving with a savage, joyful power that made the tenants stop their work and watch. Emmerich had drowned 7 months ago, a frozen river, a crossing attempted in poor light, a current that pulled man and horse under in an instant. They had found Emmerich's body 2 miles downstream. Solstice had somehow fought his way to the bank and stood there on the frozen mud, trembling and wild-eyed, refusing to be led away from the water until the grooms came with ropes. Since that day, the horse had become something else entirely. He would not be ridden. He would not be handled. He kicked at the walls of his stall with a rhythmic, relentless fury that left the wood splintered and the grooms' nerves in tatters. He bit anyone who came within reach. He screamed a high, tearing sound that carried across the grounds and into the house itself, a sound so raw and desolate that even the most hardened stable hand winced to hear it. Tallis, the head groom, had tried everything. Patience, firm hands, quiet voices, warm mash, a different stall, an open paddock. Nothing worked. The animal was grieving with a ferocity that no human remedy could touch. The Duke had given orders that Solstice was to be kept comfortable but contained. He could not bring himself to sell the horse or have him destroyed. Solstice was the last living thing that had loved Emmerich, and putting him down felt like a second burial. So the horse remained, a 4-legged monument to sorrow, penned in the far paddock where his rages could do the least harm. The staff avoided the paddock entirely. The fence rails had been reinforced after Solstice had shattered 2 of them with his chest. A standing instruction, older than Garrick's notice about the carriage, forbade anyone from approaching the enclosure without the head groom present. Solstice was not a horse. He was a hazard. Avon first passed the far paddock on her 4th day at Thornmere. She had been sent to collect wild rosemary from the kitchen garden beyond the stables, a task that took her along the gravel path that skirted the enclosure fence. She was walking quickly with her head down, her basket over her arm, her thoughts turned inward. She did not notice the horse at first. She noticed the silence. Solstice, who had been pacing the fence line with his usual restless fury, had stopped. He stood motionless at the far corner of the paddock, his great head raised, his nostrils flared, his black ears pitched forward. He was watching her, Avon paused, aware of the sudden absence of sound. The constant drumbeat of his hooves against the earth, a sound so persistent it had become part of the landscape, had ceased. She turned and saw him. For a moment, neither moved. The wind stirred the loose strands of her hair beneath her cap. The horse's mane lifted and fell. Then Solstice did something he had not done for anyone in 7 months. He walked forward. Not at a charge, not with his teeth bared and his eyes rolling. He walked slowly, deliberately, his head lowered, his steps careful and measured, as though he were approaching something fragile. He came to the fence and stopped. He stretched his neck over the top rail and breathed out, a long, shuddering exhalation that sent a plume of warm air into the cold. Avon looked at him. She did not step back. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, her basket of rosemary hanging from her arm, her face calm and open and unutterably sad. She recognized what she saw in those dark, liquid eyes. She saw it every morning in the mirror. She did not touch him. She did not speak. After a long, still moment, she turned and continued on her way. Behind her, Solstice watched her go. He did not scream. He did not kick. He stood at the fence with his head over the rail and was quiet. It happened again the next day, and the day after that. Whenever Avon's duties took her past the paddock, the horse would stop his pacing and come to the fence. He would stand there still and calm, and watch her pass. The grooms noticed first, then the kitchen staff, who could see the paddock from the scullery window. Then, inevitably, Mr. Garrick. The whispers doubled. The girl who had already been marked by the carriage incident was now performing something that looked to the superstitious minds of the servants' hall like witchcraft. She had bewitched the Duke's mad horse. She had some dark power over animals. She was an ill omen, a harbinger of further misfortune in a house already drowning in grief. Avon heard the whispers. She heard them in the careful way the cook handed her the kitchen scraps for the compost, as though even their fingers might brush and transfer some contamination. She heard them in the sudden hush that fell over the laundry room when she entered to collect the linens. She heard them in Garrick's new habit of appearing at odd moments, standing in doorways she was about to pass through, his gray eyes watching her with an intensity that went beyond the professional vigilance of a steward managing his staff. He was not merely suspicious of her now, he was studying her, trying to fit together the fragments of a picture he did not yet want to see whole. The carriage, the name, the horse. 3 impossibilities attached to one quiet housemaid who had arrived with forged references and a carefully rehearsed story about being an orphan from a village in Cumberland. 3 threads that, if pulled together, would lead to a truth that Mr. Garrick had spent 2 years believing was safely buried. And in the library above the courtyard, a room she had not yet been able to enter, Corwin Deverell, the 9th Duke of Thornmere, sat at his desk surrounded by papers he could not bring himself to read. He heard the silence from the paddock. He went to the window and looked down. He saw the black horse standing calmly at the fence. He saw the small figure in gray walking away along the gravel path, a basket on her arm, her steps unhurried. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know that she was the answer to a question he had not thought to ask. But he watched her until she disappeared around the corner of the kitchen garden, and the silence from the paddock, that impossible, merciful silence, settled into his chest like a stone. Her name was not Avon Calder. It had never been Avon Calder. Her name was Thessaly Ashburn, and she had come to Thornmere Hall, not for wages, not for shelter, not for the thin comfort of regular meals in a shared room in the servants' quarters. She had come for justice and she had come for proof, and she carried both pursuits inside her like a second heartbeat, constant and concealed and dangerously alive. Her father, Hadrian Ashburn, had been a man of quiet brilliance, a naturalist, a botanical illustrator, and a fellow of the Royal Society. He had spent his life cataloging the wild flora of the English countryside with a precision an artistry that had made his published volumes collectors' treasures. His watercolors of ferns and mosses were so detailed that botanists across Europe used them as reference texts. His field journals, filled with meticulous observations in his small, elegant hand, were considered invaluable records of landscapes that were vanishing under the plow in the factory. He had been a gentle man, a widower who had raised his only daughter alone in a rambling cottage in Devon called Ashburn Lodge, teaching her Latin and Greek alongside the common names of wildflowers, showing her how to grind pigments and prepare vellum, how to see the architecture hidden inside a leaf. Thessaly had grown up in a world of ink-stained fingers and glass-fronted cases filled with pressed specimens of long walks through dripping woodland and quiet evenings by the fire, with her father reading aloud from Pliny, while the rain beat against the windows. It was a small world, but it was whole, and it was hers. Hadrian Ashburn had died 2 years ago of a fever that took him in less than a week. Thessaly, stunned and grieving, had expected to inherit what he had always promised her. The cottage, his library, his collection of original illustrations, and a modest sum held by his solicitor. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to sustain an independent life. Enough for a woman of education and modest needs to live with dignity. She had received none of it. Within a fortnight of her father's burial, a man named Doran Garrick had appeared. He was a distant relation of Thessaly's late mother, a cousin she had met perhaps twice in her childhood, a man with a broad, florid face and small, cunning eyes, who spoke of family obligation with a warmth that never reached above his smile. He produced a revised will, one that her father had supposedly signed just weeks before his death, leaving everything to Garrick as the nearest male relation: the cottage, the library, the illustrations, the savings, all of it. Thessaly was mentioned only in a brief final clause that granted her £20, and wished her well. She had protested. She had wept. She had gone to her father's solicitor, only to discover that the man had been replaced by a new firm, one that Garrick had appointed. She had appealed to the local magistrate, a man who played cards with Garrick every Thursday evening. She had written letters to her father's colleagues, but by then Garrick had already sold the illustrations to a private collector in London and had begun the process of selling the cottage itself. The money vanished into a web of debts and investments that Thessaly had no power to trace. She was left with nothing. £20, a single trunk of personal belongings, and the knowledge that everything her father had built, everything he had meant to leave her, had been stolen by a man who shared her blood and felt no shame in the taking. Doran Garrick had been thorough, but he had not been perfect. 6 months into her destitution, while she was surviving on the charity of a retired schoolmistress in Exeter who had known her mother, a letter had found her. It was from a man named Professor Wyland, an elderly botanist who had been her father's closest professional friend. He had been traveling abroad when Hadrian died and had only recently learned of the circumstances. He was outraged, and more importantly, he remembered something. In the final year of his life, Hadrian Ashburn had been engaged in a private commission. The Duke of Thornmere, the old Duke, Corwin's father, had invited him to the estate to document and illustrate the rare alpine flora that grew in the high fell gardens. It was a prestigious project. Hadrian had spent several months at Thornmere Hall, working in the Duke's private study, given full access to the estate's extensive botanical library. He and the old Duke had become friends, united by their shared passion for the natural world. Professor Wyland remembered Hadrian speaking of this friendship with great warmth. He also remembered something else, something that Hadrian had mentioned in passing during their last meeting before the professor departed for the continent. Hadrian had told him that he had grown uneasy about his wife's family, particularly her cousin Garrick. He suspected the man was watching his affairs with an acquisitive interest. And so, as a precaution, he had placed certain documents in safekeeping at Thornmere Hall: the original deed to Ashburn Lodge, his true and final will, and a letter explaining his wishes. He had entrusted them to the Duke, a man he trusted above all others. But the old Duke had died just 3 months after Hadrian himself, carried off by a seizure in his sleep. And with him had died the knowledge of where those documents were kept. They were somewhere inside Thornmere Hall. In a study, in a library, in a hidden drawer or a locked cabinet, waiting. Thessaly had read the professor's letter 3 times, then she had burned it in the grate, memorized its contents, and begun to plan. It had taken her 4 months to prepare. She had studied the workings of a great household, from books, and from the careful observation of a manor house near Exeter, where the schoolmistress had connections. She had practiced the tasks of a housemaid until her hands, once trained for watercolor brushes and magnifying lenses, could wring a mop and scrub a hearthstone without hesitation. She had invented Avon Calder, a girl from Cumberland, orphaned by typhus, quiet and capable, and entirely unremarkable. She had forged references with a hand so steady and a knowledge of ink so precise that even a careful reader would not question them, and she had come north. Across the length of England, by coach and by cart and on foot through the last muddy miles, to this vast, cold, grieving house on the Northumbrian moors. She had presented herself at the servants' entrance on a morning in early August, been interviewed by Mr. Garrick himself, and had looked into the face of her enemy's brother without a flicker of recognition crossing her own. Garrick had not recognized her. Why would he? He had never met her. Doran had done the dirty work alone. To the steward of Thornmere Hall, she was merely another girl seeking a position, another pair of hands to fill a vacancy left by a maid who had married a tenant farmer. He had glanced at her references, asked 3 questions about her experience, and assigned her to the lower house rotation. She had walked into the servants' hall, set down her single bag, and felt the vast, cold machinery of the great house close around her like a jaw. 3 months she had been here. 3 months of scrubbing and polishing and carrying and bowing her head, learning the rhythms of the household, the layout of the rooms, the habits of the staff, the locked doors and the unlocked ones. 3 months of watching Garrick move through his domain with the smooth authority of a man who believed his secrets were safe. 3 months of searching for an opportunity to enter the one room she needed most, the Duke's private study on the 2nd floor, where her father had worked, where the old Duke had kept his most personal papers. The study was Garrick's territory. He managed the estate's accounts there. He kept the keys. He controlled access with the vigilance of a man guarding something more precious than ledgers, though perhaps he did not know exactly what he was guarding. Perhaps his brother had never told him precisely what Hadrian Ashburn had left behind. Perhaps Garrick only knew that the name Ashburn was dangerous, and that any trace of it needed to be erased. And then Thessaly had written it on the carriage window. It had been an act of desperation born of mounting frustration. 3 months of careful patience, and she was no closer to the study than on her first day. Garrick's routines were iron. His surveillance was constant. Her opportunities were non-existent. She had lain awake night after night in her narrow bed, listening to the breathing of the other maids, feeling the walls of her disguise tighten around her like a shrinking garment. She was losing time. The new Duke might clear out the old papers. Garrick might discover the hidden documents himself and destroy them. Every day that passed was a day closer to the permanent burial of her father's truth. So she had risen before dawn, slipped out of the servants' quarters, and crossed the frozen courtyard in her stockinged feet. She had stood before the carriage, her breath a pale cloud in the darkness, and she had pressed her finger to the frosted glass. One word, her name, her father's name, the name of the home that had been stolen from her. Ashburn. It was not a plan, it was a provocation. She wanted Garrick to know that someone inside his carefully controlled world carried that name like a blade. She wanted him unsettled, distracted, prone to the kind of mistake that careful men make. Only when they are afraid. She wanted to shake the ground beneath his feet and see what fell loose. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the tremor would spread, or how far it would reach, or that the strange, broken horse in the far paddock would become the second thread in a web she could not have designed if she had tried. She had not sought Solstice any more than Solstice had sought her. They had simply recognized each other, two creatures stripped of everything they loved, surviving on nothing but the stubborn refusal to stop breathing. And now, standing at the scullery window as the autumn rain streaked the glass, watching the black horse pace the fence line in the distance, Cecily Ashburn understood that her careful, solitary mission was becoming something larger and more dangerous than she had planned. She was no longer invisible. The word on the carriage had seen to that. The horse had seen to that. And somewhere above her, in the room she could not enter, a duke she had never spoken to, sat in his dead brother's shadow, governing a house whose deepest secrets he did not yet know he possessed. She turned from the window, dried her hands on her apron, and went back to work. The proof was here. She could feel it in her bones, in the same way she could feel Solstice's grief resonating with her own across the cold distance of the courtyard. She just had to find it before Garrick found her. Kerwin Devereux learned of the word on his carriage 2 days after it had been wiped from the glass. He learned of it not from Garrick, who had buried the incident beneath a layer of administrative silence, but from old Tallis, who mentioned it in passing while discussing a cracked wheel rim during their morning walk through the stables. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but it was the same morning the frost got into the axle grease. Someone had written on the carriage window a word. Mr. Garrick had it cleaned off straight away." Corwin stopped walking. What word? Tallis shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the Duke's sudden full attention. "Ashburn, your grace. Just the one word, traced in the frost. Ashburn." Corwin turned the name over in his mind. It meant nothing to him, or it should have meant nothing. Yet it snagged on something, a faint, buried recognition like the sound of a bell heard from a great distance. He could not place it. He filed it away in the quiet, methodical manner he applied to all things he did not yet understand, and asked no further questions of Tallis, but he asked Garrick. He raised the matter that afternoon in the study, casually, as though it were a minor curiosity and nothing more. "I understand there was some disturbance with the carriage, something written on the glass." The steward's reaction was masterful in its control. Only a man who was watching for it, as Corwin now was, would have caught the hairline fracture that ran through Garrick's composure. Pash. A fractional tightening of the muscles around his eyes. A pause, no longer than a heartbeat, before his answer came. "A prank, your grace. One of the stable boys, most likely. I dealt with it and posted a notice to discourage any repetition. And the word itself. Gibberish, your grace, meaningless." Garrick had never lied to him before, or perhaps he had, and Corwin had simply never had cause to notice. But he noticed now. The steward's voice was steady, his posture correct, his gaze appropriately deferential. Everything about him was precisely calibrated to convey unconcern, and that precision was what betrayed him. A man who was genuinely unconcerned did not calibrate. He simply was. Corwin said nothing more. He let the subject drop, and Garrick withdrew with his usual crisp efficiency. But the splinter was in now, lodged beneath the surface of the trust that Corwin had always extended to his steward without question. Gibberish. Meaningless. The words themselves felt like a door being pulled shut in his face. That evening, restless and unable to concentrate on the stack of tenancy agreements on his desk, Corwin left the study and walked the grounds. The November air was raw and sharp, tasting of iron and coming snow. He walked without destination, following the gravel paths that wound through the formal gardens and out past the kitchen block toward the stables. His feet carried him, without his conscious direction, to the far paddock. Solstice was standing at the fence. He was still. His great black head was raised, his ears pricked forward, and he was looking toward the kitchen garden with an expression that Corwin could only describe, absurdly, as expectation. The horse was waiting for something, or someone. Corwin stood in the shadow of the stable wall and watched. Minutes passed. The light was failing, the sky turning the color of bruised plums above the moor. Then a figure appeared on the path from the kitchen garden, small and slight in a gray dress, a basket of herbs over her arm. The new housemaid, Avon. She walked with her head down, her steps quick but unhurried. She did not look toward the paddock. She gave no sign of awareness that the horse existed. Yet as she passed, Solstice moved to the fence rail closest to her path. He stretched his neck over the top rail and stood motionless, his dark eyes tracking her until she rounded the corner of the kitchen block and vanished from sight. Then the horse let out a long, soft breath and lowered his head. Corwin did not move for a long time. He thought of Emmerich. He thought of the way Solstice had been with his brother, that fierce, joyful bond between man and animal. Emmerich had always said that horses knew things that people did not. They could read the truth of a person in their scent, their movement, the rhythm of their heartbeat. A horse will never love a liar, Emmerich had told him once, laughing, his arm slung across Solstice's great neck. They are far too honest for that. The memory hurt, as all memories of Emmerich did. But this time, the pain carried something new with it. A question. What was it about this quiet, unremarkable girl that a horse consumed by grief recognized as worthy of its attention? What did the animal see that the rest of the household could not? Corwin had noticed her before, of course. In the peripheral way one notices all servants, a presence defined by efficiency and silence. She was good at her work. She caused no trouble. She attracted no attention except from the horse and from Garrick. And Garrick's attention, Corwin now realized, had a quality that went beyond a steward's ordinary oversight of his staff. There was a watchfulness in it, a tension, as though the man were guarding something that the girl's mere presence threatened. A word on a carriage window, a horse that would not be tamed, suddenly gentle, a steward who lied about a prank. And at the center of it all, a housemaid who moved through his house like a shadow, seen by everyone and known by no one. Corwin turned from the paddock and walked back toward the house. The library windows were dark. The study lamp was unlit. For the first time in months, he did not want to work. He wanted to think. He wanted to understand. And he found, with a surprise that unsettled him, that what he wanted most of all was to look at the girl again, to study her face, to see if the truth that the horse perceived was visible to human eyes as well. He did not yet know that it was. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The opportunity came on a Thursday in late November, 3 weeks after the Carriage incident. Garrick was away. The Duke's northern tenants had sent word of a boundary dispute that required the steward's personal inspection, and he had departed at first light with the estate surveyor, not expected to return until the following evening. His absence sent a visible wave of relief through the household. The cook hummed as she rolled pastry. The footmen leaned against the banisters and exchanged gossip they would never have risked within Garrick's hearing. Even the air in the corridors seemed lighter, as though the house itself could breathe more freely. Thessaly felt none of that lightness. She felt only the weight of the hours, ticking away like sand through a glass. No. Garrick would be gone for one night in which his study, the room her father had worked in, the room where the old Duke had kept his most personal papers, would be unguarded. The key, she knew, hung on a ring in the steward's pantry. She had watched Garrick take it each morning and return it each evening for 3 months. She knew where it was kept. She knew the lock. She worked through the day with a mechanical focus, scrubbing the morning room, polishing the dining room candlesticks, beating the dust from the heavy curtains in the blue parlor. Her hands performed each task with their usual competence, but her mind was far away, rehearsing the route from the servants' quarters to the steward's pantry to the second-floor study. Every step, every door, every creaking floorboard she had mapped in the dark of sleepless nights. She waited until the house was asleep. The other maids in her shared room were deep in their exhausted slumber by 10:30, their breathing slow and even. Thessaly lay still until the mantel clock in the corridor struck 11. Then she rose, dressed silently in the dark, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and slipped from the room. The servants' corridor was black. No moon tonight, and the single tallow candle left burning on the hall table had guttered to a stub of wax. She did not light a new one. She moved by memory, her stockinged feet silent on the cold boards, her right hand trailing along the wall. The steward's pantry was at the end of the corridor, behind a door that she had never been permitted to open. It was unlocked. She had gambled on that and won. Garrick locked his study, not his pantry. Inside, the room smelled of boot polish and lamp oil. She felt along the wall until her fingers found the row of hooks where the household keys hung. Third, from the left. A heavy iron key, cold against her palm. She closed her hand around it and felt the shape of it press into her skin like a promise. The journey from the servants' quarters to the main house required passing through the green baize door that separated the two worlds. The door swung silently on its oiled hinges. Beyond it, the house was different. The ceilings were higher, the air was colder. The silence had a different quality, not the cramped quiet of sleeping bodies, but the vast, echoing hush of empty grandeur. She climbed the main staircase, keeping to the edge where the steps were less likely to groan. The portraits of the Deverell ancestors watched her from the walls, their painted eyes catching the faint glimmer of starlight from the landing window. She reached the second floor and turned left, past the closed doors of the family bedrooms, past the linen closet, past the small sitting room that no one used, to the study door at the end of the hall. The key turned with a sound that seemed to crack the silence like a stone thrown through glass. She froze, her breath held, her ears straining. Nothing. The house slept on. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was smaller than she had imagined. A single window overlooked the courtyard. A heavy oak desk dominated the center, flanked by two tall cabinets of dark wood. The walls were lined with shelves, not of books, as in the library below, but of ledgers, estate maps, rolled documents tied with faded ribbon, and boxes of correspondence. And on the far wall, in a section she had not expected, a set of shallow drawers of the kind used to store large format artwork, portfolio drawers. Her heart lurched. She crossed the room and pulled open the top drawer. Inside, laid flat between sheets of protective tissue, was a watercolor painting of extraordinary delicacy. A spray of mountain saxifrage rendered in such precise, luminous detail that the tiny flowers seemed to glow in the darkness. She knew the brushwork. She knew the particular shade of green, mixed from viridian and raw umber, that had been her father's signature. She knew because he had taught her to mix it herself, sitting beside her at the work table in the cottage, his steady hand guiding hers. She pressed her fingers to her mouth to keep the sound inside. She had found him. Not the documents. Not yet. But him. His hand, his eye, his patient genius, preserved in pigment and paper in a drawer in a house where no one knew his name. She pulled open the second drawer. More illustrations. Ferns. Lichens. A stunningly detailed study of a juniper branch heavy with berries. Each one was unsigned, but each one was unmistakably his. She opened the third drawer. More pressed specimens. More field notes in her father's hand. But no legal documents. No deed. No will. They had to be here somewhere, in another drawer, behind a panel, in a compartment she had not yet found. She needed more time. She reached for the fourth drawer. Her fingers had just closed around the handle when the door opened behind her. The light came first. A lamp held high, its glow flooding the room in sudden amber. Then the voice, low and quiet and carrying the absolute authority of a man in his own domain. Close the drawer. Thessaly's hands went still. Her back was to him. She could feel the heat of the lamp on her neck, could see her own shadow thrown long and dark across the open drawer. She closed it. She did not turn around. Corwin Deverell stepped into the room. He set the lamp on the desk. The light carved his face into sharp planes of gold and shadow, his expression unreadable but his eyes intensely, burningly alert. He had not been asleep. He was fully dressed, his coat unbuttoned, his dark hair disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. He had been in the library below. He had heard the key in the lock. "Turn around." She obeyed. She had no choice. She turned and faced him, her chin lifted, her hands at her sides. The lamplight fell full upon her face, and she saw his eyes move over it, reading her expression with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything. "You are in my steward's study," he said, "in the middle of the night, with his key in your hand." His gaze dropped to her right hand where the iron key was still clenched in her white-knuckled grip. "I will ask you once, and I will know if you lie. What were you looking for?" The silence was immense. She could hear the wind outside, pressing against the window glass. She could hear the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, counting the seconds of her unraveling. "The paintings," she said. Her voice did not waver. His brow contracted. "The paintings. The botanical illustrations in the portfolio drawers. They are watercolors of alpine flora, mountain saxifrage, juniper, heart's tongue fern. The pigments are hand-ground. The technique is known as dry brush layering over a wet wash base. The green is mixed from viridian and raw umber in a ratio of 3:1. She was speaking too quickly, too precisely. She knew it. She could not stop. The words poured out of her like water through a cracked dam, carrying with them the debris of 2 years of silence. The artist would have worked from living specimens, gathered from the fells above this house. He would have pressed samples first, then painted from the fresh cuttings before they wilted. His field notes would be on the reverse of each sheet, written in a small left slanting hand. Corwin stared at her. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and pulled open the top drawer. He lifted the first watercolor and turned it over. On the reverse, in a small, left slanting hand, was a dense block of field notes. He set the painting down. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of an interrogation. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of. "Who are you?" he asked. It was the same question, stripped of its accusatory edge. It was asked not by a duke to a servant, but by one human being to another, in a room full of beautiful, fragile things that suddenly seemed to belong to her more than to him.
"I am a housemaid, Your Grace,"
she said. The words tasted like ash. He looked at her hands. They were rough and reddened, a servant's hands. But they had just described the precise technique of a trained botanical illustrator with the fluency of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the craft. "No," he said quietly. "You are not." He walked past her to the door. He held it open. "Go back to your room. Do not speak of this. Leave the key on the desk." He paused, his hand on the doorframe, his back to her. "The paintings. Do you know who made them?" The truth rose in her throat like a tide. My father made them. He made them here in this room, for your father, who was his friend. And everything he left me was stolen by a man whose brother sleeps under your roof and eats at your table and holds the keys to your house." She swallowed it all. "I know only that they are very fine, Your Grace," she whispered. He nodded once a curt, unsatisfied motion, and she passed through the door. She walked the dark corridor on legs that felt made of water. Behind her, the Duke of Thornmere stood alone in his steward's study, surrounded by paintings he had never examined, made by a man whose name had been whispered on his carriage window, and felt the foundations of his ordered world shift beneath him like sand. Garrick returned the following evening. Thessaly saw the carriage from the upper landing window, watched the steward descend with his leather case and his surveyor's maps, and felt the fragile reprieve of his absence collapse like a held breath finally released. He would check his study. he would notice. A drawer left not quite flush, the key replaced at a slightly different angle on its hook. Garrick was a man who noticed everything. It was his profession and his pathology. She was right. By the following morning, the change in him was visible. He appeared at breakfast with the coiled energy of a man who has been given proof of a suspicion he has long nurtured. His slate eyes moved over the assembled staff with a new and terrible purpose. He spoke little. He ate nothing. He left the table before the meal was finished and went directly upstairs. The summons came at noon, not for Thessaly. For the Duke, Garrick requested a private audience and was granted one in the library, the room Corwin preferred for all formal household business. The steward entered and closed the door behind him. His face was composed, grave, righteous. He had prepared this performance with the care of a man who understood that his next few words would determine the shape of his future. "Your Grace, I must report a serious breach of trust. During my absence, someone entered my study without authorization. The lock was opened with the pantry key, which was taken and returned. Certain drawers were disturbed. I believe the purpose was theft." Corwin sat behind his desk, his expression neutral. He said nothing. Garrick continued, his confidence building in the silence. "I have conducted my own inquiry among the staff. The night porter confirms that no one entered the main house through the front or garden doors. The breach must therefore have come from within, through the servants' passage. I have examined the evidence, and I believe the perpetrator to be the housemaid known as Avon Calder. On what grounds?" Corwin's voice was dangerously level. "On multiple grounds, Your Grace. She has been the subject of concern since her arrival. The incident with the carriage window occurred in the courtyard outside her morning route. Her behavior around the horse is irregular and has caused unease among the staff. And most significantly, I have received a report from the night porter that a figure matching her description was seen in the main house corridor at approximately 11 o'clock on Thursday evening. It was a masterful construction. Each element was plausible. Each was vague enough to resist challenge, but specific enough to convey conviction. And the conclusion, left unstated but unmistakable, was that Avon Calder was a thief who should be dismissed at once and possibly handed to the magistrate. Garrick stood before the Duke with the patient confidence of a man who had served this family for a decade, a man whose word had never been questioned, a man who had controlled this household with an iron competence that made him indispensable. He did not know that the Duke had been in the study that night. He did not know that Corwin had watched the girl open the portfolio drawers with trembling hands, had heard her describe the brushwork and the pigments with the fluency of someone who knew the artist intimately. He did not know that the Duke had spent the 2 days since that encounter in a state of quiet, relentless thought, turning the fragments of this puzzle over and over in his mind. The word on the carriage, the horse, the paintings, the girl's voice in the dark, precise and passionate, and full of a grief she could not quite conceal. And now Garrick, standing before him, offering not truth, but a carefully assembled fiction, designed to remove the girl from the house before she could reveal whatever it was that she knew. "You say the night porter saw her?" Corwin said slowly. "Yes, Your Grace." "Which night porter, Bellamy or Hatch?" A fractional hesitation. "Hatch, Your Grace. Hatch was not on duty Thursday evening. He was in the village attending his sister's lying-in. Bellamy covered for him. The silence that followed was surgical. Corwin watched the color drain from his steward's face in a slow, revealing tide. It was a small error, a minor detail, but it was the thread that, once pulled, would unravel everything. Garrick had not spoken to either porter. He had fabricated the report entirely. "I may have been mistaken about the name," Garrick said, recovering with admirable speed. "It was Bellamy. I spoke to him briefly and may have confused the two." "You may have," Corwin agreed, his voice soft as falling snow. "Or you may not have spoken to anyone at all." The words landed in the room like a blade driven into wood. Garrick's jaw tightened. For the first time in the years Corwin had known him, The steward's composure showed a genuine crack. Not a hairline fracture this time, but a fissure, deep and unmistakable, running through the foundation of his authority. Your Grace, I assure you my concern is entirely for the security of this household. I have no doubt of that, Corwin said. He let the ambiguity hang in the air. The sentence could be read as trust or as accusation. He intended both. The matter is noted, Garrick. I will look into it personally. You are dismissed. The steward stood for a moment longer, his mouth slightly open, the argument he had prepared dying on his lips. He had come into this room, expecting a swift victory. He was leaving with nothing but the dawning and terrible understanding that his master no longer believed him. He gave a stiff bow and left. Corwin remained at his desk for a long time after the door closed. His fingers rested on the surface of the wood, still and steady, but beneath his ribs his heart was beating with a hard, deliberate rhythm. Garrick had lied. Not with the clumsy improvisation of a man caught off guard, but with the practiced fluidity of a man who was accustomed to constructing realities for other people to inhabit. The fabricated night porter, the carefully assembled case against the girl, the urgency of his desire to see her removed. Why? What was Garrick protecting? What was the connection between a steward who lied and a housemaid who could describe the technique of a botanical painter with the authority of a scholar? What linked both of them to a word traced in frost on a carriage window? Ashburn. The name surfaced again in his mind, and this time it did not sink. This time it floated, persistent and luminous, demanding attention. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him, dipped his pen, and wrote the word in the center of the blank page. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a sheaf of his father's old correspondence letters. He had never had the heart to read. He began to search. The next morning, before the household had finished breakfast, the Duke of Thornmere did something unprecedented. He walked into the servants' hall. The room fell silent, as though a blade had dropped through the air. Spoons halted midway to mouths. The cook froze with a teapot in her hand. Even the kitchen cat, a fat ginger creature that feared nothing, slunk under the bench. Corwin stood in the doorway in his riding coat, tall and severe, his presence so alien to this room that the walls themselves seemed to shrink around him. He did not look at any of them, except one. "Avon," he said. His voice was calm and measured and carried no warmth, but it carried no accusation either. "You are reassigned. From today, your duties will include the care and exercising of the horse called Solstice. You will report to Tallis in the stables each morning at 7. Your household duties will be adjusted accordingly." The silence in the room was so complete that Thessaly could hear the fire popping in the grate 10 feet away. Every face in the servants' hall turned to her. She felt their stares like the heat of a brand. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. "Tallis will provide instruction," Corwin continued. "The arrangement is effective immediately." He paused, and his gaze swept the room with the slow, heavy authority of a man who owned every stone and timber within a mile. "Any questions regarding this arrangement should be directed to me, not to Mr. Garrick." He left without waiting for a response. The green baize door swung shut behind him. The servants' hall erupted in a storm of whispered speculation that would not die down for days. "Not to Mr. Garrick." The words detonated through the household like a charge set beneath a foundation wall. In 5 words, the Duke had done what no formal reprimand could have achieved. He had drawn a line between his own authority and his steward's, and he had placed the quiet housemaid on his side of it. The implications were staggering, and every soul in the house understood them instantly. Garrick understood them best of all. Thessaly saw him once that morning, crossing the courtyard as she made her way to the stables. He stopped when he saw her. Their eyes met across 30 feet of gravel, and in his gaze she saw something she had never seen there before. Not anger, not contempt, fear. Raw, cornered, animal fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes that the walls he has built around his secrets are no longer under his control. He said nothing. He turned and walked away, his spine rigid, his hands locked behind his back. The notice about the carriage defacement vanished from the board that same afternoon. No one removed it publicly. It was simply gone, as though it had never existed, and in its absence the air in the servants' hall felt different, lighter, uncertain. The old order was cracking, and no one yet knew what would replace it. At the stables, Tallis greeted Thessaly with the gruff bewilderment of a man given an order he did not understand but would not question. He handed her a lead rope and walked her to the far paddock. Solstice was standing at the fence, waiting. When Thessaly approached, the great black horse lowered his head and pressed his muzzle into her open palm. His breath was warm against her skin, and the sound he made was not the scream that had terrorized the grooms for 7 months. It was a low, vibrating rumble, deep in his chest, a sound of recognition, a sound of trust. Tallis stared. He took off his cap, rubbed the back of his head, and put the cap back on. "Well," he said, and could find nothing else to add. Thessaly wrapped her arms around the horse's neck and buried her face in his dark mane. She did not cry. She was too tired for tears, too wary of the fragile new ground beneath her feet, but she held on, and the horse stood still, bearing her weight as though it were nothing, as though he had been waiting his whole grieving life for exactly this. Lady Honora arrived at Thornmere in the first week of December, carried in by a hired coach from the station at Hexham, with 2 trunks, a lapdog named Biscuit, and a temperament that could strip paint from a door at 20 paces. She was the Dowager Duchess, Corwin's mother, and she had not visited the estate since Emmeric's funeral. Her absence had been deliberate. She had buried one son, and could not bear to watch the other bury himself in work and silence and the slow, corrosive denial of his own grief. But letters from the housekeeper, from Tallis, and from the village rector had reached her in Bath, each one painting a picture of a household in quiet disarray, a steward losing his grip, a horse miraculously tamed, a maid at the center of everything. She had come to see for herself. She found Thessaly on her second afternoon in the small herb garden behind the kitchen, where the girl was cutting rosemary for the cook. Lady Honora appeared at the garden gate without announcement, her lapdog tucked under one arm, her sharp hazel eyes taking in the scene with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people the way her late husband had read maps. "You are the girl," she said. It was not a question. Thessaly straightened, the rosemary shears still in her hand. "Your Grace, put those down and walk with me." They walked together along the gravel path that skirted the walled garden and led toward the orchard. Lady Honora moved slowly, her breath clouding in the cold air, her eyes fixed ahead. She did not speak for a full minute. When she did, her voice had lost its commanding edge and was instead quiet, almost conversational. "My son has changed since I was last here. He is still severe. He is still impossible to read, but something has shifted in him. He watches things now instead of merely looking at them. He notices. He asks questions, where he used to issue instructions." She glanced sideways at Thessaly. "I suspect you are the cause. I am only a housemaid, Your Grace." "You are nothing of the sort." Lady Honora stopped walking. She turned and took Thessaly's right hand in both of hers. She turned it over and examined the palm with the brisk thoroughness of a physician. "These calluses are 3 months old. Beneath them, the skin is smooth. The fingers are long and precise. These are the hands of someone who worked with fine instruments, not scrubbing brushes." She released the hand and looked into Thessaly's face. Her gaze was not unkind, but it was relentless. "I have known 3 types of women in my life. Those who hide their strength, those who hide their weakness, and those who hide their identity. You are the 3rd. And you are doing it very badly, my dear, because the horse sees through you. My son sees through you. And now I see through you." Thessaly's throat tightened. The shears trembled in her other hand. She wanted to speak. The words were there, crowding behind her teeth, pressing against the wall of caution she had built and reinforced every single day since she arrived at this house. But the wall held, as it always did. "I cannot say, Your Grace," she whispered. "Not yet." Lady Honora studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, a single decisive motion. "Very well, I will not press you, but know this." She reached out and tucked a strand of loose hair behind Thessaly's ear, a gesture so maternal and so unexpected that it nearly broke her. "When the time comes, and it will come soon, you will not face it alone. My son may be impossible, but he is just, and I am neither impossible nor patient. Which means if you do not tell him the truth soon, I will find it out myself." She turned and walked back toward the house, the lapdog bouncing in her arms, leaving Thessaly standing among the bare apple trees with the rosemary shears pressed against her chest and a crack running through the last of her defenses. Corwin found the letter on the third night of searching. His father's correspondence was vast, disorganized, and stored in no particular order across 4 cabinets in the library. The old Duke had been a prodigious letter writer, maintaining friendships and professional relationships with naturalists, artists, academics, and landowners across England and the continent. Sorting through it was like excavating a buried city, layer after layer of a life, lived in conversation with the world. The letter was near the bottom of the 3rd cabinet, tucked inside a folio of pressed botanical specimens. It was written on good paper in a small, left-slanting hand that Corwin now recognized with a jolt of certainty. He had seen that handwriting before, on the reverse of the watercolor paintings in Garrick's study. "My dear Duke," the letter began, "I write to you in confidence and in trust, as I have come to value your friendship above almost all others. My health has begun to falter, and I find I must make provisions that I had hoped to delay for many years yet. I have enclosed with this letter certain documents of the utmost personal importance: the deed of title to my property, Ashburn Lodge in Devon; my true and final will, which names my daughter Thessaly as my sole heir, and a private letter to her to be delivered upon my death. I take this precaution because I have grown deeply uneasy about a man named Dorand Garrick, a cousin of my late wife. He has shown an unwholesome interest in my affairs and my estate, and I fear that if the worst should come, he will move to seize what is rightfully my daughter's. She is young and would have no means to fight him. I entrust these documents to you because you are a man of honor, and because I know they will be safe within the walls of Thornmere. Should anything befall me, I beg you to see that they reach Thessaly's hands. She is everything to me. She is my life's work in a truer sense than any book or painting I have ever produced. With the deepest gratitude and affection, your friend, Hadrian Ashburn." Corwin set the letter down on the desk. His hands were shaking, not with surprise, for the shape of the truth had been forming in his mind for days, now each fragment clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. The word on the carriage, the horse, the paintings, the girl's voice in the dark, describing her father's technique as though the memory lived in her fingers. But knowing and seeing are different things, and the letter in Hadrian Ashburn's own hand made the abstract concrete and the suspected certain. His father had been entrusted with the future of a young woman, and that trust had died with him, unfulfilled, forgotten, buried in a cabinet beneath pressed ferns and old correspondence. And the brother of the man who had stolen her life had been sleeping under this roof for a decade, eating at his table, carrying his keys, governing his household. Corwin stood and crossed the library to the fireplace. He gripped the marble mantelpiece with both hands and bowed his head. A cold, white rage was building in his chest, not the hot fury of impulsive anger, but something far more dangerous. The slow, implacable fury of a just man who discovers that injustice has been conducted in his name and under his roof. He thought of her scrubbing the floors of his house on her hands and knees. He thought of her eating alone in the servants' hall while the other maids whispered about witchcraft. He thought of her standing in Garrick's study in the dead of night, trembling, reaching for a document that contained the only proof of who she was. She had walked into the house of her enemy and lived as a servant for 3 months, enduring cold and isolation, and the casual cruelties of a household that did not know her, because it was the only way to recover what had been stolen. And he, the Duke of Thornmere, the master of this house, had been blind to all of it. He returned to the desk and searched the folio with careful, deliberate hands. Beneath the letter, wrapped in oilskin, he found them. The deed to Ashburn Lodge, heavy parchment, sealed with wax, naming Thessaly Ashburn as the sole owner. The true will, signed and witnessed, leaving everything to his beloved daughter. And a sealed letter addressed in Hadrian's hand, simply to my dearest girl. Corwin did not open that last letter. It was not his to read. He gathered the documents together, placed them in the center of his desk, and sat down in the lamplight to decide what to do. Justice was not revenge. It was not spectacle. It was the restoration of what had been taken, performed with the same quiet precision with which it had been stolen. He rang the bell and summoned the footman. "First light tomorrow," he said. "Bring Mr. Grack." Garrick and the maid called Avon to the library. Together, they arrived within minutes of each other, and the difference between them was the difference between a man walking to his sentencing. Garrick entered first. He was dressed impeccably, his collar starched, his waistcoat buttoned to the throat, every detail of his appearance arranged to project the authority he could feel crumbling beneath him. His face was composed, but his eyes were not. They moved to the desk, to the documents laid out upon it, and something behind them collapsed like a wall struck by a battering ram. Thessaly came in moments later, escorted by the footman. She was in her gray dress, her cap in place, her hands clasped before her. She looked at the Duke first, then at Garrick, then at the desk. She saw the oilskin wrapping. She saw the heavy parchment. She saw the small, sealed letter addressed in a hand she would have known anywhere on earth. Her knees almost gave way. She caught herself on the back of a chair and held on, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Corwin stood behind his desk. He did not sit. He wanted to be standing for this. He wanted the full weight of his position and his presence to bear down upon the room like the stone walls of the house itself. "Mr. Praps."
Garrick?
He began, his voice quiet and level. "When I asked you about the word on my carriage window, you told me it was gibberish, meaningless. Do you recall?" Garrick's mouth opened. No sound emerged. "The word was Ashburn. It is not gibberish. It is a name, the name of a family." Corwin picked up the letter from the desk and held it so that the handwriting was visible. The name of a man called Hadrian Ashburn, a naturalist and painter who was a guest in this house, a friend to my father, and the creator of every botanical illustration in your study upstairs. He set the letter down and picked up the deed. Hadrian Ashburn had a daughter, his only child. He left her everything, a cottage in Devon called Ashburn Lodge, his library, his life's work. He entrusted the proof of that inheritance to my father for safekeeping, because he feared rightly that a man named Doran Garrick would attempt to steal it. The name fell into the silence of the room, like a verdict. Garrick flinched. It was a small movement, a contraction of the shoulders, but in a man of his rigid self-control, it was as telling as a confession. "Doran Garrick?" Corwin repeated. "Your brother—" Silence. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire whispered. Outside, a horse, perhaps Solstice, stamped in the stable yard. Your brother produced a forged will. He replaced the solicitor. He sold the library. He took the cottage. And he cast a young woman of education and character into the street with nothing but £20 and a warning to make no trouble. Corwin's voice had not risen. It had dropped, becoming quieter with each sentence, which made it infinitely more devastating. And you, Mr. Garrick, knew. You may not have planned it. You may not have profited directly, but you knew. You knew the name Ashburn, and when it appeared on my carriage window, you did not report it to me as an honest man would. You suppressed it, You lied about it. You posted a notice designed to frighten the staff. And when you discovered that someone had been in your study, you fabricated an accusation against the one person in this house who had every right to be there. He turned to Thessaly. His expression changed. The granite severity softened into something raw and unguarded, something that no member of this household had ever seen on the face of the Duke of Thornmere. Remorse. Profound, unqualified remorse. "Is that not so?" he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Ashburn, the sound of her real name spoken in this room, in this house where she had been invisible for 3 months, struck her like a physical blow, not a blow of pain, but of release, as though a chain she had been dragging for 2 years had suddenly fallen from her wrists. The tears came, silent and unstoppable, running down her face and falling onto her clasped hands. She nodded. She could not speak. Garrick made a sound, a low, strangled noise, half denial and half surrender. He looked at the documents on the desk, at the Duke's implacable face, at the weeping girl beside him, and he understood that every wall he had built, every lie he had told, every small cruelty he had inflicted to protect his brother's crime. "I did not know the details," he said, his voice breaking. "Doran said the girl had no claim. He said the father's estate was in debt. I believed him." "You believed what was convenient to believe," Corwin said. "And when the truth walked into your household and scrubbed your floors and endured your contempt, you tried to destroy her rather than face it." He picked up the documents, the deed, the will, the sealed letter, and walked around the desk. He stopped before Thessaly. He held them out to her. "These belong to you," he said. "They have always belonged to you." She took them. Her hands were trembling so badly that the parchment rustled like leaves in a wind. She held them against her chest, clutching her father's handwriting to her heart, and the sound she made was not a sob but something deeper and quieter, the sound of a person being returned to themselves after a long and terrible absence. Corwin turned back to Garrick. "You will leave Thornmere today. A carriage will take you to Hexham. From there, you will travel to your brother, and you will tell him that the Duke of Thornmere's solicitors will be contacting him within the week regarding the full restitution of the Ashburn estate. Every penny, every book, every acre. If he cooperates, I will not involve the magistrate. If he does not, I will pursue this to the fullest extent of the law, and I will make certain that every society in England knows the name Garrick for exactly what it is." The steward stood motionless. Then, without a word, he gave a single bow and walked from the room. He did not look back. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Thessaly and Corwin stood alone in the library. The fire crackled. The documents were warm against her chest. She looked up at him through her tears, and what she saw in his face was not pity. It was not triumph. It was the look of a man who had found something he did not know he had been searching for, and who was already afraid of losing it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me," he said, his voice rough. "My family failed you. I failed you. This is not generosity. It is a debt repaid too late." She shook her head. "It is not too late." The silence between them was full of things unsaid, things that could not yet be spoken in a room still warm with the aftermath of justice and the ghost of injustice. He wanted to ask her to stay. She could see it in the way his hand lifted and then fell back to his side. But the ground between them was too newly turned, too raw. She was no longer a maid, but she was not yet sure what she was, and neither was he. She left Thornmere 3 days later. She packed her single bag, the same bag she had arrived with, and added to it the oilskin packet of documents and her father's sealed letter, which she had read alone in her room by candlelight, weeping until the candle burned to nothing. She said goodbye to Tallis, who shook her hand with a bewildered formality. She said goodbye to Lady Honora, who kissed her forehead and pressed a card into her hand with an address in Bath. She went to the paddock and stood with Solstice for a long time, her arms around his neck, his great head resting on her shoulder. She did not say goodbye to Corwin. She could not. If she stood before him and looked into his face, she would not be able to leave. And she needed to leave. She needed to go home, to stand on her own ground, to reclaim her name in a place where it had first been given to her. She needed to become Thessaly Ashburn again before she could become anything else. She left a note on his desk, a single line, in her own careful hand. Remember, winter came to Thornmere like a punishment. The snow arrived in December and did not relent. It buried the gardens, the paths, the far paddock. It pressed against the windows of the great house and turned the moor into a vast white silence that felt to Corwin like an accusation. The house was quieter than it had ever been. A new steward had been appointed, a competent and unremarkable man from Durham who managed the accounts with efficiency and inspired neither fear nor loyalty. The meals were adequate. The corridors were clean. None of it mattered. Solstice stopped eating on the 4th day after Thessaly left. Not with the violent refusal of his earlier grief, but with a quiet, deliberate withdrawal that was somehow worse. He stood in his stall and turned his head from every offering. Hay, oats, warm mash, the winter apples that Tallis brought from the cellar stores. The horse simply stood and waited, his dark eyes fixed on the paddock gate, watching for someone who did not come. Corwin visited the stable every evening. He would stand outside the stall and look at the horse, and the horse would look back at him, and between them passed an understanding that neither could have articulated, but both felt with a visceral, bone-deep certainty. They were waiting for the same person. They were incomplete in the same way. Lady Honora, before her departure for Bath in mid-December, had been characteristically direct. "You are a fool," she told her son over breakfast on her last morning. "You found her, you saved her, you gave her back her name, and then you let her walk out of your house without saying a single word about what she means to you." "She needed to go," Corwin said quietly. "She needed to be asked to stay. There is a difference. One is abandonment, dressed as respect. The other is honesty." She set down her teacup with a decisive click. "Write to her. Go to her. Do something, Corwin, before that wretched horse starves himself to death and you calcify into a statue behind that desk." The solicitor's work progressed through the winter months. Dorian Garrick, faced with the combined legal weight of the Duke of Thornmere's attorneys and the evidence of his own fraud, capitulated without a fight. Ashburn Lodge was returned to Thessaly's name. A settlement for the stolen library and illustrations was agreed. The funds were substantial. By the first thaw in March, Thessaly Ashburn was, on paper at least, a woman of independent means, living in her own home, on her own land, free. Corwin knew all of this because the solicitors reported to him. He also knew, from a brief and courteous letter Thessaly had sent to Lady Honora in February, that she had returned to Devon, that she was restoring the cottage, that the garden was overgrown, but the walls were sound, that she had found, in a box in the attic that Dorian Garrick had overlooked, a set of her father's watercolor brushes and a cake of viridian pigment, and that she had begun to paint again. She had not written to him. The only word she had left him was the one on his desk in her careful hand, remember. He did not need the instruction. He remembered everything. The frost on the carriage window, the horse at the fence, her voice in the dark study, describing her father's brushwork with a fluency born of love. The way she had held the documents against her chest as though they were a living thing, she was afraid might stop breathing. On the first morning of April, Corwin rose before dawn. He dressed in his traveling clothes. He walked to the stable and found Tallis already there, as though the old groom had known without being told. "Have Solstice readied," Corwin said. "We are going south." Tallis looked at him. A slow, creased smile spread across his weathered face. The first real smile Corwin had seen from the man in nearly a year. "About time, Your Grace," he said, and went to fetch the bridle. The road from Northumbria to Devon was long, and Corwin did not hurry it. He rode part of the way and led Solstice behind the carriage for the rest. stopping at coaching inns each night, letting the horse graze in unfamiliar meadows, watching the country change around him as the bleak northern moors gave way to softer hills and greener valleys. Spring was unfolding across England in a slow, deliberate wave, and he moved through it like a man waking from a long sleep, seeing color and warmth for the first time in months. He had never made this journey before. He had never had reason to travel so far from Thornmere for anything that was not duty or obligation. This was neither. This was the most selfish and the most necessary thing he had ever done. He found Ashburn Lodge on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of April. It sat at the end of a narrow lane bordered by hawthorn hedges, white with blossom. A modest stone cottage with a slate roof and a garden that was, as Thessaly had written, overgrown but clearly loved. There were signs of recent work everywhere, a freshly turned flower bed along the south wall, new glass in the kitchen window, a wooden bench beneath an old apple tree, still damp with morning dew. He tied the carriage horse to the gate-post and led Solstice up the path by hand. The horse was alert, his ears forward, his nostrils flaring. He could smell something. He could feel something. His hooves quickened on the flagstones. The front door opened before Corwin could knock. She stood in the doorway in a dress of faded blue, her dark auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare on the stone threshold. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard work and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from its foundations. But her eyes were clear. They were the green-gray of the sea in spring, and they were looking at him with an expression that contained surprise and disbelief, and something else, something fierce and fragile that made his chest ache. Then she saw Solstice. The horse pulled forward against the lead rope, and Corwin let him go. Solstice crossed the short distance between them in 3 strides, and pushed his great head against her chest, nearly knocking her backward through the door. She caught him, her arms going around his neck, her face buried in his mane, and the sound the horse made was not the scream of the tortured animal she had first encountered at Thornmere. It was a deep, rolling sigh of arrival, the sound of a creature that had finally, after a long and bitter winter, come home. Corwin stood on the path and watched them, the woman and the horse, and he felt the last of his careful, constructed reserve crack open like ice on a river in spring. He had crossed 300 miles of England for this, not for duty, not for justice, for her. She looked up from the horse's neck. There were tears on her face, but she was smiling. "You brought him," she said, her voice breaking. "He would not eat," Corwin said. "He would not rest." He paused, as was I. She released the horse and stepped forward. She stood before him on the garden path, barefoot, her hair tangled with strands of Solstice's mane, her eyes searching his face. "You came all this way," she said. "I would have come farther." "Why?" He had rehearsed this speech across 200 miles of English road. He had composed it in coaching inns and revised it in the saddle, and discarded it entirely somewhere south of Oxford. Now, standing before her in the spring sunlight, he found that none of the careful words remained. There was only the truth, plain and unadorned. "Because you left a word on my carriage window, and it was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. Because a horse that loved my brother chose you, and my brother was the finest judge of character I have ever known. Because you walked into my house with nothing and showed me what courage looks like. And because the silence at Thornmere since you left has been unbearable, and I have come to understand that it is not the silence of an empty house. It is the silence of a house that is missing the person it was built for." He took her hand. Her fingers were stained with green pigment, viridian and raw umber, her father's colors. They curled around his, warm and strong and steady. "I did not come to rescue you, Thessaly. You rescued yourself long before I understood what was happening. I came to ask if you would let me stand beside you, not as your benefactor, not as your patron. As your equal, And if you will have me as your husband." She looked at him for a long time. The apple tree above them shifted in the breeze, scattering white petals across the path. Solstice stood behind her, his head high, his dark coat gleaming in the spring light, utterly still, utterly at peace. "I left that word on your window because I wanted someone to remember," she said quietly. "I did not imagine that the someone would be you. I did not imagine that you would cross the country to stand in my garden and say these things to me." She tightened her grip on his hand. "But I have learned, these past months, that the things we do not imagine are often the truest things of all." She stepped closer. She lifted her free hand and rested it against his chest, over his heart. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Corwin, I will have you." He did not kiss her then. It was not quite his way. Not yet. Instead, he lifted her hand from his chest and pressed his lips to her paint-stained fingers, a gesture so gentle and so deliberate that it said more than any declaration could. Behind them, Solstice lowered his head and breathed out a long, contented sigh that stirred the fallen petals at their feet. The cottage stood warm and solid at their backs. The Devon hills rolled green to the horizon. And in the garden of a house that had once been lost and was now found, two people who had come to each other through grief and silence and the stubborn refusal to surrender, stood together in the spring light, their hands joined, their future unwritten, and every honest word between them shining like frost on glass.